There is a number that every elder of the Velu knows, though none of us speak it willingly. It is not a distance or a mass or a frequency. It is a duration. And it is the reason the Velu Concord's official trade protocol now contains a clause that no other species in the compact has ever required. Mandatory shift documentation with continuous audio transcription during any negotiation session exceeding 16 hours with a human counterpart. I am Grandmother Pelun. I have held the title of Rememberer for the Velu Concord for 41 cycles, and in that time I have gathered 93 verified accounts of the trait I am about to describe to you. I have cross-referenced them against medical telemetry, shipping manifests, dock authority records, military after-action reports, and 3 independent xenobiology studies commissioned by the Concord Science Bureau at my personal request, and funded by the Trade Safety Endowment that I established 11 cycles ago when I realized the existing literature was dangerously incomplete. I have arrived at a conclusion that I will share with you now because you are the next generation of trade delegates, and you must understand what you are walking into before you walk into it. The number is 72. 72 standard hours. That is how long a human being can remain fully awake, fully functional, and fully aware without any chemical assistance, any technological augmentation, or any measurable cognitive collapse. Their reaction times degrade, but within a range that would still exceed the peak performance of a rested Velu at their sharpest hour. Their emotional regulation narrows, which means they stop performing social warmth and pleasantries, which means they become more efficient, not less. Their speech patterns simplify, which means their communication becomes more precise, not more muddled. Their body temperature drops by approximately half a degree, which the xenobiologists tell me is a metabolic conservation mechanism that redirects caloric energy from thermal regulation to neural function. But they do not stop. They do not become vulnerable. They do not enter the shutdown spiral that every other sapient species in the compact undergoes after 30 hours of sustained wakefulness. Where our minds dim, theirs focus. Where our bodies demand payment, theirs defer the bill. And the ones who have trained for it, the ones their military designates as special operations personnel, can push past 72 into territory that our biologists cannot model, because our biologists fall asleep before the observation period ends. I will tell you 9 stories, not because 9 is a sacred number, though for the Velu it is. Because 9 is how many verified accounts I have selected from the 93 in my archive that will make you understand the shape of this trait in a way that raw data cannot. Data tells you what. Stories tell you why you should be afraid. Listen carefully. Your careers depend on the listening. Your safety may depend on it as well. The first story was given to me by a dock inspector named Tivu Paran, who worked the overnight freight rotation at Shelf Station Kethais 4 for 11 years before requesting permanent reassignment to a daylight post. She told me this account in her retirement alcove on Velu Prime, sitting in a pool of morning light with a cup of seed tea that she never once lifted to her lips because her hands would not stop trembling long enough to manage it. Her chromatophores had not settled to resting color in the 3 years since the event. The physician who referred her to me had noted persistent stress patterning in her dermal layer consistent with unresolved pre-response activation, the kind of deep biological unease that our bodies produce when they have identified a predator and never received the signal that the predator has moved on. Tivu Station received a human freighter called the Millicent Gage on a routine cargo run. The ship had been in transit for 19 days on a skeleton crew of 4. Standard docking protocol at Kethais 4 required any crew to submit to a fatigue assessment before unloading hazardous cargo, which in this case was 1,400 liters of industrial solvent rated for atmospheric processors. The solvents were classified as volatile under certain pressure conditions, flammable under others, and required precise handling by personnel whose cognitive function met minimum thresholds. Tivu administered the fatigue assessment personally because the overnight staff physician was treating an unrelated case, and Tivu was cross-certified in basic fatigue screening. The captain, a woman named Asha Reeves, registered on the intake biometrics as having been continuously awake for 41 hours at the time of docking. Tivu noted this on the intake form and flagged it for immediate medical review because 41 hours of wakefulness in a VLU would produce full catatonic shutdown, not drowsiness, not impairment, complete neurological cessation of voluntary function. A VLU at hour 41 would be on the floor, unresponsive, breathing but unreachable, and would remain that way for 8 to 12 hours while their brain chemistry reset. The medical review was conducted by a Sorshi physician named Dr. Pelling, who ran a standard 5-domain cognitive battery, pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, reaction timing, verbal recall, and fine motor coordination. He administered it in the station's medical bay with Tivu observing from the doorway. Captain Reeves scored in the 92nd percentile across all 5 domains. Dr. Pelling stared at the results for 14 seconds without speaking. Tivu counted the seconds because her prey instinct had sharpened her awareness to the point where she was counting everything, monitoring everything, the way our ancestors monitored the grass around a water source. Pelling recalibrated the testing equipment. He ran the battery a second time. The scores improved by 2 points. He ran it a third time. The scores held steady, still in the 92nd percentile, still exceeding the baseline performance of most species at full rest. He asked Captain Reeves how she felt. She said she was a little tired but had slept well the day before yesterday and would probably turn in after the cargo was offloaded. She stretched her shoulders when she said it, the casual rolling motion of a body that was stiff but functional, the motion of someone who had been sitting in a pilot's chair too long, not the motion of someone whose biology was 41 hours past its designed operating limit. The day before yesterday, 41 hours ago, and she described that sleep as having been good, as though it were a recent meal she was still digesting, as though the distance between her last rest and this moment was manageable, moderate, a thing she could cross without particular effort. The way a VLU might describe a 6-hour stretch, not 41. Tivu told me that she watched Captain Reeves supervise the offloading of all 1,400 liters of volatile industrial solvent across a 6-hour operation that required continuous attention to pressure gauges, labeling protocols, storage temperature, and cargo bay sequencing. The captain's hands were steady on every manifest she signed. Her voice was clear on every order she issued to her crew and to Tivu's dock workers. Her decisions were sharp, immediate, unhesitating. She caught a labeling error on canister 47 that Tivu's own rested team had missed. She corrected a flow rate calculation that the station's automated system had rounded incorrectly, a rounding error that could have caused a pressure spike in the solvent storage bay. At hour 47 of her personal wakefulness, she was performing better than the rested station crew around her. At hour 49, she signed the final manifest, shook Tivu's hand, and walked back to her ship. Tivu's hand trembled when she told me this, and I could see the memory playing behind her eyes like footage she had reviewed too many times. Not the memory of danger, the memory of wrongness, the memory of how warm and dry and perfectly still the human's grip had been at hour 49, how the bones beneath the skin had felt solid and purposeful and unhurried, how the woman's palm had not been damp with stress hormones, and her fingers had not quivered with fatigue. As though the woman's body did not know, on any level in any system, through any feedback mechanism, that it was supposed to be failing. As though failure at 49 hours was a concept that applied to other species, to lesser architectures, to bodies that had not been built by a planet that required more. The second story came from a military attaché named Commander Sorval of the VLU-Concord Intelligence Bureau, who was embedded with a joint VLU-Thessaloniki border patrol during the intersection crisis 6 cycles ago. The patrol was tasked with monitoring a disputed corridor between two territorial claims for evidence of smuggler traffic. The rotation schedule, designed by conquered military psychologists based on decades of cognitive performance research, called for 8-hour shifts with mandatory rest periods of equal length. Every crew member was expected to sleep during their off shift. The Velu and Thessany crews followed this schedule with the mechanical discipline of species that understand, on a cellular level, what happens when wakefulness debt accumulates past the point of diminishing returns. The human liaison officer, a man named Sergeant Davis Park, did not follow the schedule. Commander Sorval noticed on the second day that Sergeant Park's access badge had not registered an entry to the sleep quarters since the patrol's departure. He assumed the badge reader was malfunctioning. On the third day, he checked the ship's internal sensor logs and discovered that Park's access badge was functioning correctly. The human had simply not entered the sleep quarters at all for 3 days. When confronted, Park explained that he had been reviewing sensor logs from the previous 18 months of corridor traffic and had found several patterns that warranted further analysis. He said he had lost track of time. He said it apologetically, the way a student apologizes for missing a meal because they were reading, not the way a soldier apologizes for a 3-day breach of mandatory rest protocol. Sorval ordered him to sleep. Park complied without argument. He slept for 4 hours, woke on his own without an alarm at a time that did not correspond to any scheduled wake cycle, ate a protein bar while walking to the sensor station, and resumed his analysis. On the 4th day, Sorval checked the station's access logs again with a thoroughness that he later described to me as obsessive. The logs showed that Park had been accessing the sensor feeds continuously during what were supposed to be his rest periods. The activity patterns showed sustained analytical work with no gaps longer than 12 minutes, and the 12-minute gaps corresponded to times when Park had used the sanitary facilities. Park had been reviewing raw data, cross-referencing transit signatures against historical manifests, and constructing a predictive model of smuggler behavior patterns. He had done this work during the hours when the rest of the crew, Velu and Thessany alike, had been unconscious. On the 5th day, the full scope of Park's wakefulness became clear. The human had been awake for a continuous stretch of 53 hours, during which he had identified and flagged 3 separate smuggler transits that the rested Velu analysts working in their carefully designed 8-hour cognitive performance windows had missed entirely. The flags were accurate. All 3 transits were later confirmed by interdiction teams operating on Park's intelligence. The correlation model he had built, working alone in the sensor station while everyone else slept, became the standard operating template for the patrol's remaining deployment. It was later adopted by 2 other conquered border patrols as a baseline analytical framework. Sorval filed a formal report with the Conquered Intelligence Office. The report is classified, but Sorval shared one line with me that I have committed to memory because it haunts me in the quiet hours before my own sleep. The human's analytical capability at hour 53 exceeded my own capability at hour 2 of a fully rested shift. I do not believe this represents an anomaly or an exceptional individual. I believe this is their baseline operating architecture, and we have been measuring their performance against the wrong biological standard. I asked Sorval if Park had seemed impaired in any way during those 53 hours. He was quiet for a long moment, cycling through memory the way our people do when we are searching for precision rather than speed, his chromatophore shifting toward the amber of careful recollection. Then he said the only change he noticed was that Park smiled less. On the 1st day, the human had been warm, conversational, quick with small observations about the corridor's geography or the quality of the ship's food. By the 3rd day, the small talk had stopped entirely. The human's face was calm, composed, attentive, but the warmth had been set aside. Everything else, the focus, the precision, the physical control, the quality of his analytical output, had remained constant or measurably improved. Park smiled less. That was the only visible evidence of 53 continuous hours without sleep. As though the human body, rather than shutting down under sustained wakefulness, simply reallocated the energy it would have spent on social performance, on friendliness, on the ornamental warmth that makes interactions pleasant, and redirected every spare calorie toward sustained cognition. As though warmth were a luxury module that their biology could shed like a stage on a rocket when the mission required it, and the underlying engine, stripped of its decorative casing, ran colder and cleaner and sharper than before. The third story is the one that changed my understanding of this trait from a biological curiosity to a strategic concern, requiring formal conquered policy intervention. A Velu trade envoy named Peloson, one of the Concord's most experienced negotiators, was leading a mineral rights agreement with a human delegation on Station Terk 3. The negotiations were projected to last 3 standard days and covered extraction rights for 17 rare mineral deposits on a contested world. The stakes were significant. The Velu delegation consisted of 12 members organized into 4 rotating teams of 3, so that no individual negotiator would be at the table for more than 6 hours at a stretch. Each team was briefed by the outgoing team during a 30-minute handoff period. Each negotiator entered the chamber rested, fed, and cognitively fresh. This is standard Concord diplomatic protocol, the product of 200 years of behavioral research into optimal negotiation performance. Fatigue degrades judgment. Fresh minds produce better agreements. This is not opinion. It is neurochemistry. The human delegation consisted of 4 people, the same 4 people, for 3 days. They did not rotate. On the first day, Peloson noted that the humans seemed relaxed, open, collegial. They made small talk between clause reviews. They offered concessions on minor procedural points as gestures of goodwill. They asked about Velu cultural practices and mineral processing traditions with what appeared to be genuine curiosity and even delight. They laughed at appropriate moments. One of them, the lead negotiator, a woman named Catherine Akafer, complimented the Velu delegation's preparation materials. The day ended with modest progress on both sides and a general atmosphere of mutual respect. On the second day, the Velu rotated in a fresh team per protocol. Negotiators Peloson 3, rested and briefed, took the morning seats. The humans across the table were the same 4 people who had been there the day before. They were slightly quieter. Their small talk had contracted. Their proposals were more precisely worded, the language tighter, the conditional clauses fewer but more structurally significant. They retracted 2 of the previous day's minor concessions, not confrontationally but with clear technical justification that the Velu team needed 40 minutes to fully parse. They replaced those concessions with counter-proposals that appeared, on their surface, to be more favorable to both parties. It took the Velu analysts 3 hours of off-table review to identify that the restructured clauses were architecturally advantageous to the human position in ways that only became visible when modeled across the full 17-deposit portfolio. The humans had not left the negotiation chamber in 22 hours. They had eaten at the table, meals delivered by station catering. They had used the chamber's adjoining sanitary facilities in rotation, never all 4 absent simultaneously, never breaking the thread of conversation for more than 7 minutes. Catherine Akafer's notes, which Peloson glimpsed when Akafer turned a page, were more detailed, more cross-referenced, and more annotated than anything the 4 Velu teams had produced across their combined 6-hour shifts. Peloson was resting during the second-day afternoon session when her deputy woke her with chromatophores cycling through distress patterns that Peloson had never seen on that particular officer's face. The deputy said that the humans had not slept and that something in the negotiation chamber had changed. She could not articulate what it was. She said it felt as though the atmospheric pressure in the room had shifted while every gauge remained steady. She said the humans were still polite, still professional, still technically collaborative, but that the collaboration had developed an architecture she could feel but not name. On the third day, Pelisson returned to the table herself. The humans had been awake for approximately 40 continuous hours. They were no longer making small talk. They were no longer asking about Velu mineral traditions. They were no longer laughing. Their faces were calm, composed, professionally pleasant. Their posture was unchanged from day one. But the warmth, the curiosity, the social generosity that had characterized the first day had been set aside like a garment they no longer needed. What remained was pure structural thinking. Every proposal was a load-bearing wall in a building the humans had been continuously constructing for 40 hours, while the Velu team handed its blueprint from one set of hands to another every 6 hours, and lost architectural context with every transfer. The agreement they reached favored the human position by 11% more than the Velu analysts had projected as the human best-case outcome. Pelisson did not realize this until she reviewed the final terms with fully rested eyes 4 days later, running the full 17-deposit portfolio model that should have been running continuously during the negotiation, but that had been fragmented across 4 different analyst teams who had each modeled their own 6-hour window without fully integrating the work of the teams before them. I asked Pelisson whether she believed the humans had done this deliberately, whether the refusal to rotate their personnel was a conscious negotiation tactic, a strategy designed to exploit the biological asymmetry between species. She was quiet for a very long time. Her chromatophores went still, which in a Velu means the question has reached a depth where instinct and intellect are in genuine conflict and neither is willing to yield. Then she said, "Grandmother, I do not think they refused to rotate. I think it simply did not occur to them that rotation was necessary. And that is worse than a tactic because a tactic can be identified and countered. An architecture cannot. You cannot counter gravity. You can only build structures that account for it." The fourth story is shorter and more personal in its horror. A Velu cargo handler named Resk was working a joint shift with a human dockworker named Miguel at a refueling platform in the Kethais corridor. They were 20 hours into a shift that was supposed to end at 12. The platform had suffered a coolant pump failure that endangered a medical transport route, and both workers had volunteered to stay on until the replacement pump arrived, because taking the platform offline would have diverted emergency medical traffic through a corridor with a 16-hour longer transit time. At hour 20, Resk's vision began to blur. This is the standard Velu visual degradation curve. Our photoreceptor cells deplete their signaling molecules after approximately 18 hours of wakefulness, and no amount of training, willpower, stimulant, or determination can override the depletion. The molecules must regenerate during a sleep cycle. It is chemistry, not character. Resk told Miguel that he needed to rest his eyes for a few minutes. Miguel said, "Sure thing, brother, get some rest. I'll keep everything running." Resk closed his eyes in the platform's rest alcove for what he intended to be a brief respite. He woke 9 hours later in the platform's medical bay, where a medic had moved him and connected him to a hydration line, because his body had gone into full involuntary shutdown, and his fluid balance had dropped below safe thresholds. During those 9 hours, according to the platform's maintenance logs, security footage, and system event records that I reviewed frame by frame, Miguel had continued working alone. He had received the replacement coolant pump when it arrived at hour 23 of his shift. He had unboxed it, inspected it, identified a manufacturing defect in one of the ceiling gaskets, sourced a replacement gasket from the platform's emergency stores, installed the pump, and calibrated the coolant flow across the platform's 7 distribution nodes. That calibration normally requires 2 certified technicians working in coordinated sequence and takes 4 hours. Miguel completed it alone in 3 hours and 14 minutes, and his calibration values, when later audited by Concord maintenance inspectors, were within tighter tolerances than the manufacturer's specifications required. He had then filed the maintenance report. He had cleaned the work area. He had reorganized the tool storage bay, which had been in disorder for weeks according to the platform's previous inspection notes. He had stood a security watch for the remaining 4 hours of his shift because the relief crew's shuttle had been delayed by a navigation beacon malfunction. During that security watch, he had identified and logged a minor atmospheric leak in Section 7 of the platform that had been present for an estimated 3 weeks without anyone noticing. When Resk found Miguel afterward to apologize for collapsing during a critical repair, Miguel was eating breakfast in the platform's galley. He had been awake for approximately 33 hours. He had a smear of coolant lubricant on his left forearm that he had apparently not noticed. He told Resk not to worry about it. He said these things happen. He asked if Resk wanted some eggs, and when Resk said he was not hungry, Miguel asked if Resk was feeling okay and whether the medic had cleared him to return to duty, and there was genuine concern in his voice. Concern for the Velu who had slept for 9 hours while the human worked alone through the night. Resk told me this story with his chromatophores cycling through distress patterns he could not consciously suppress. Not because Miguel had been unkind. The horror was precisely that Miguel had been perfectly kind. The human had absorbed 9 additional hours of skilled technical labor, creative problem-solving, administrative documentation, and security duty onto his own body without complaint, without visible strain, without any apparent awareness that what he had done exceeded the biological capacity of every other sapient species in the known galaxy. To Miguel, it was a long day. It was overtime. It was the kind of thing that sometimes happened when the work needed doing, and you were the one still standing. The word still, I keep returning to it. The human was still standing, still functional, still kind, still asking his colleague if he wanted eggs. As though the word still, which for every other species implies effort and resistance and the grinding sound of will against chemistry, was for humans simply a description of their default state. The 5th story concerns a human researcher named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who was assigned to a joint xenobiology study at the Concord Science Bureau on Velu Prime. The study's subject was a bioluminescent organism called a phase bloom, an extraordinarily rare creature whose reproductive cycle spanned exactly 70 hours and involved a complex sequence of color frequency modulations that encoded genetic selection information in its light emissions. Understanding this reproductive cycle was considered one of the highest priorities in Concord xenobiology because it had implications for bioengineering and agricultural genetics across 12 member worlds. The observation protocol called for continuous monitoring throughout the entire 70-hour cycle. The Velu team had designed an elaborate relay system, 8 scientists working in overlapping 4-hour shifts, with a 30-minute handoff protocol between each pair to ensure continuity of observation. Each incoming observer was briefed by the outgoing observer, given a summary of the preceding 4 hours, and shown the running log. It was a well-designed system, the product of years of refinement. It accounted for Velu cognitive limits. It maximized fresh attention across the longest possible observation window. Dr. Tanaka asked if she could observe the entire 70-hour cycle personally. The team lead, Dr. Suvan, a senior xenobiologist with 30 years of experience, explained patiently and without condescension that the reproductive cycle lasted 70 hours and that no single observer could maintain the required attention span and analytical rigor across that duration. The handoff protocol existed precisely because individual sustained attention was biologically unreliable over such periods. She cited the literature. She cited her own experience. She was, by every measure, correct. Dr. Tanaka said she understood the concern and appreciated Dr. Suvan's thoroughness. Then she asked again if she could try. She said she had done similar extended observations during her doctoral research on Earth, monitoring the migration patterns of a bird species called an Arctic tern across 40-hour continuous observation windows, and she believed she could maintain the necessary focus. She asked if a Velu shadow observer could be assigned to take over if she reached her limit, so that no data would be lost. Dr. Suvan agreed, partly out of scientific curiosity, partly out of the courtesy that the Velu extend to visiting researchers. Partly, she told me later, because something in the calm certainty of Dr. Tanaka's request made her wonder whether the literature she had cited was less universal than she had assumed. Dr. Tanaka observed the phase bloom for 68 of its 70-hour reproductive cycle. She slept once, for approximately 90 minutes, during a quiescent phase that she herself had predicted based on her observation of the preceding 40 hours of the organism's behavior. She had identified the quiescent phase's signature 18 hours before it occurred, based on a subtle deceleration in the organism's baseline luminescence frequency that no Velu observer had ever documented, because it accumulated too gradually to be visible within a 4-hour observation window. She positioned her sleeping area within arm's reach of the observation station. She set no alarm. She woke on her own after exactly 92 minutes, checked the organism's status display, confirmed it was still in the predicted quiescent phase, drank a glass of water, ate a nutrition bar, and resumed observation. The Velu shadow observer, who had been watching Dr. Tanaka as much as the organism, reported that the human's transition from sleep to full wakefulness took approximately 45 seconds. Dr. Tanaka's notes from hour 65 of the observation were more detailed, more precisely time-stamped, more analytically rigorous, and more creatively insightful than the notes produced by any Velu observer at hour 2 of their fresh 4-hour shift. Her handwriting was steady. Her diagrams were clean. Her cross-references were accurate. At hour 65, she was producing original scientific analysis at a level that the Velu team's best researcher could not match at hour 1. She identified the subphase, the critical 11-minute window during which the phase bloom selected which genetic material to incorporate into its reproductive output. It occurred at hour 57 of the cycle, and it had been missed by every previous observation team, because it coincided with a shift-change handoff when the outgoing Velu observer was briefing the incoming observer, and neither was watching the organism directly. The subphase involved a specific color frequency modulation that Dr. Tanaka described in her notes as a brief violet flicker at 412 nanometers followed by a sustained blue-green pulse at 497 nanometers, approximately 0.3 seconds in duration, repeating at decreasing intervals over 11 minutes. It was the genetic selection mechanism, the key to the organism's diversity, the answer to a decade of anomalous data. It was published in the Concord Journal of Xenobiology under Dr. Tanaka's name as lead author. The paper was cited 1,400 times in 3 years. The acknowledgments thanked the Velu team for their hospitality and their excellent seed tea. Dr. Suvan told me this story with spiritual vertigo in her voice. She was not fighting sleep, grandmother, she said. She was managing it. She identified the optimal window based on the organism's behavior. She slept for precisely the duration her body required. She woke without external stimulus and resumed at full capacity. There is a difference between a consciousness losing a battle against sleep and a consciousness scheduling sleep as a resource. She was in control. At hour 68, that is a different kind of brain. The sixth story came from a passenger transit authority clerk named Volin, who worked the overnight registration desk at a way station in the outer shelf for 9 years before transferring to an administrative position that did not require overnight shifts. She requested the transfer, she told me, not because the overnight hours were difficult but because she could no longer sit alone at a desk in a quiet station at night without listening for footsteps that should not be there. Her shifts were typically peaceful, Most travelers slept through the overnight hours, following the biological rhythms of their species, the way planets follow orbital tracks. The desk existed to handle emergencies and process early morning departures, and most nights Volan spent her time reviewing cargo manifests and drinking seed tea. One night during the third hour, a human woman came to the desk and asked if there was a library or reading terminal available. She was middle-aged, perhaps 50 by human reckoning, plainly dressed in standard transit clothing, carrying a worn travel bag that had the look of an object that had been to many places and served its owner faithfully in all of them. She had calm eyes and a steady voice. Volan directed her to the station's public archive, a small facility that housed a collection of physical texts and digital records from various compact member worlds. The woman thanked her warmly, asked about Volan's family with the kind of genuine interest that did not feel like a formality, and left. 6 hours later, when Volan's morning relief arrived, Volan passed the public archive on her way to her quarters. The human was still there. Not browsing the way a restless traveler might browse to pass the time between connections. Reading with the focused, sustained intensity of a professional researcher conducting field work. The woman had acquired a stack of physical texts from the station's legacy collection, volumes that had not been accessed in years according to the circulation timestamps, and was working through them systematically with a stylus and a notation pad, cross-referencing passages between volumes and constructing what appeared to be a comparative chronology of some kind on a separate sheet of paper. Volan paused in the doorway and watched for several minutes. The human did not look up. Her attention was fully absorbed. Her stylus moved with the steady, unhurried precision of someone who was not fighting fatigue, not forcing concentration, but operating well within her cognitive capacity despite having been awake for what must have been at least 9 hours and quite possibly much longer, depending on when she had last slept before arriving at the station. Volan's reaction was not professional curiosity. It was something far older, something coded into the deepest layers of Velu neurology by 100 million years of predator-prey coevolution on a world where inattention meant death. It was the involuntary hyper-awareness that activates in a prey species when it detects a creature in its environment that is still awake when the rhythm of the world says it should not be. Our ancestors survived by tracking every source of sustained wakefulness around them, by knowing which creatures in the grassland were still moving when the rest had gone still. The instinct that kept those ancestors alive does not distinguish between a predator circling in tall grass and a middle-aged woman reading quietly in a library. It knows only the fundamental wrongness of sustained wakefulness past the expected limit, and it responds with elevated awareness regardless of context. Volan returned to the archive 8 hours later at the start of her next overnight shift. She told me she had not planned to check. Her feet carried her there. The human was still there, 16 hours of continuous reading. She had rearranged the texts into thematic groups, each pile marked with a numbered annotation slip. Her first notation pad was full, covered in dense handwriting on both sides of every page. She had started a second. A third text was open in front of her, held flat with one hand while the other transcribed a passage. Her posture was straight. Her breathing was regular and unhurried. Her eyes tracked the text with steady saccadic movements that showed none of the flutter, the drift, the involuntary microcorrections that indicate fatigue in every sapient species the Concord Science Bureau has ever studied. She looked exactly as she had looked when Volan first saw her 9 hours earlier, minus the travel bag, which she had set aside. Volan asked if she was all right. The woman looked up, and her smile was immediate, warm and unforced, the smile of someone who was genuinely pleased to be interrupted by a familiar face. She said she had found a fascinating account of pre-contact Velu seasonal migration patterns in the coastal provinces and had completely lost track of time. She asked whether the Velu still practiced the traditional spring relocation to the tidal flats, and whether the autumn return ceremonies were still observed in the northern settlements. These were sophisticated questions requiring genuine knowledge of Vilu cultural geography, ethnography, and seasonal practices. They spoke for 10 minutes. The woman's recall of what she had read across 16 hours was precise, synthesized, and integrated, not the rote reproduction of memorized passages, but the structured, analytical understanding of someone who had absorbed an enormous volume of unfamiliar material and organized it into a coherent intellectual framework while seated in a library chair without sleeping. Lost track of time. 16 hours. At least 19 hours awake, possibly much longer. And her mind was sharp, her cultural knowledge was rich and appropriate, her social warmth was genuine, and she remembered Volan's children's names from a 10-second exchange 6 hours earlier. Volan told me she went back to her desk and quietly adjusted the station's internal security classification for human passengers from standard to elevated awareness, using the discretionary authority that overnight staff possess for situations that do not fit cleanly into existing protocols. Not because the woman was dangerous. The woman was charming, intellectually generous, culturally sensitive, and had shown no sign of anything remotely threatening, because the woman was awake. She was awake in a way and at a time, and for a duration that no creature Volan had ever shared a station with had been awake, and Volan's body, down in the architecture below thought, below reason, below the civilized mind that knows there is nothing to fear from a woman in a library, understood the one thing that mattered. A creature that does not sleep on schedule is a creature you must never, ever stop watching. Because the schedule is the only clock your instincts trust, and when that clock breaks, the instincts cannot be reassured. The seventh story concerns your work as trade delegates most directly, and I tell it with particular care, because the dynamic it describes is the one you will face across every negotiation table in human space. A Vilu merchant captain named Sareth Kuhn was conducting a multi-day cargo exchange with a human trading vessel in open space between the Kethais and Terk corridors. The exchange involved specialty agricultural equipment manufactured on Vilu Prime in return for human-engineered atmospheric processing components, and it required continuous coordination between the two ships' cargo handling systems over a projected 3-day transfer window. The protocol called for both captains to maintain open communication during critical transfer phases. Captain Kuhn operated on a standard Vilu schedule, 16 hours of wakefulness followed by 8 hours of mandatory rest, with his first officer managing communications during the sleep periods. This schedule was designed around the assumption, which every Vilu treats as biological law, that both parties would follow compatible rest rhythms. The human captain, a man named Elliot Bryce, did not follow compatible rest rhythms. He was, as far as the operations communication logs showed, the same person on the same channel at every hour of every day for 3 days. On the first day, Kuhn and Bryce coordinated smoothly. The human was professional, warm, efficient in his timing calls, and precise in his cargo specifications. He made small talk between transfer batches about the quality of Vilu agricultural engineering. On the second day, Kuhn noticed something that raised the fine hairs on the back of his neck, a Vilu stress indicator that we share with our distant prey species ancestors. Bryce had begun to anticipate Kuhn's requests before Kuhn made them. The human was predicting the sequence of cargo moves, the timing of consolidation intervals, even the specific phrasing of Kuhn's coordination calls, based on patterns in the exchange protocol, and in Kuhn's personal decision-making style that Kuhn himself had not consciously identified. Kuhn had only been observing the exchange for 16 hours at a time, with 8-hour gaps of unconsciousness between observation windows. Bryce had been observing it continuously, every hour, every pattern, every deviation from the mean. During one of Kuhn's rest periods on the second day, Bryce completed a complex loading sequence that required synchronized pressure matching across 4 separate cargo holds, an operation that normally demanded both captains working in tandem. Kuhn's first officer managed the Velu side. When Kuhn woke and reviewed the logs, the first officer reported, with chromatophores flickering an unease he could not suppress, that the human had guided the entire operation. Bryce had narrated each step before the first officer could identify it, described the correct procedure before the officer could look it up, and confirmed the result before the instruments finished their readings. The officer had functioned as a confirmation relay, not a co-commander. And every call the human made had been correct. On the third day, Kuhn asked Bryce when he had last slept. About 2 hours on the first night, the human said. He sounded puzzled by the question, as though Kuhn had asked him when he had last blinked. It was a function so minor to the human's biology that tracking it required conscious effort. By day 3, the operation had reorganized itself around Bryce's mind. Kuhn's crew had, without any conscious decision or explicit transfer of authority, begun deferring to the human's schedule, his priorities, his operational rhythm. The Velu first officer had stopped generating independent tactical recommendations and was instead waiting for Bryce's suggestions before acting. The cargo handlers on both ships had synchronized their loading pace to the human's voice commands rather than to the automated system's timing signals. The operations command structure, which was designed as a 2-captain cooperative, had become a single-captain hierarchy, with the Velu side functioning as an execution arm of the human's continuous situational awareness. He did not take command, Kuhn told me, and his chromatophores had gone so still they looked painted onto his skin. He did not ask for it. He did not know he had it. He accumulated it, grandmother, by being the one consciousness in the operation that never paused, never fragmented, never handed its understanding to a replacement mind that had to spend its first hour catching up. Command pooled around him the way authority always pools around certainty, and human wakefulness is a form of certainty that our biology cannot produce. We can be confident for 16 hours. They can be certain for 72, and certainty beats confidence every time. The 8th story is the one I find hardest to tell without my voice breaking, and I ask your patience if it breaks now, because this story is personal in a way the others are not. My granddaughter, Pelun Vey, 11 cycles old at the time, was enrolled in a mixed-species educational exchange program on Station Terk 3. Her class included children from 6 species, and 1 human boy of approximately the same developmental stage. His name was Marcus. He was 12 standard years old, quiet, fond of drawing geometric patterns in the margins of his assignments, polite in a way that seemed to reflect genuine character rather than the performance of obedience. His teachers described him as unremarkable in most academic metrics and extraordinary in one: sustained attention. He could sit with a single problem for hours without losing focus. At the time, they considered this a minor curiosity. It was not. During a supervised field excursion to the station's botanical conservatory, a pressurization fault in subsection D caused a structural membrane to seal automatically, trapping 8 children inside a chamber that was slowly losing atmospheric pressure through a hairline fracture in the dome's outer shell. The rescue team, led by a Thessany specialist with 14 years of emergency extraction experience, estimated a 6-hour rescue window. The atmospheric margin was 8 hours. The margin assumed that the occupants would remain calm and their metabolic rates would stay low. Within the first 2 hours, every child in the chamber except Marcus began to experience involuntary drowsiness. For the Velu children, this was the species-level stress response activating. When our bodies detect environmental danger beyond our capacity to fight or flee, our neurochemistry pivots toward shutdown. Energy conservation, metabolic suppression, the ancient, wordless biological prayer that the danger will pass while we are unconscious and still. It kept our ancestors alive in burrows while predators circled above. In a sealed chamber with falling atmospheric pressure, it meant that 7 children were drifting into unconsciousness, while the air that sustained them was slowly leaking into the void. Marcus did not sleep, not at hour 1, not at hour 3, not at hour 5. He maintained communication with the rescue team through the emergency intercom, providing status reports in clear language that never wavered. He taught himself to read the chamber's environmental panel by comparing the alien symbols to emergency placards on the wall. He reported pressure readings every 15 minutes. He moved sleeping children away from the primary leak vent, dragging the larger ones on thermal blankets. He located emergency oxygen canisters, counted them, calculated a distribution plan based on each child's size, and adjusted flow rates as children woke and slept. He sealed the worst vent leak with blanket material and adhesive strips, reducing pressure loss by 12%, which the rescue team later estimated extended the breathable atmosphere window by 50 minutes. That 50 minutes was the margin between rescue arriving in time and arriving too late. He talked to my granddaughter each time she surfaced from involuntary sleep, told her help was coming, told her to rest, told her he was watching and would not stop watching. And when she drifted back, he checked the readout, adjusted a canister, repositioned a child, updated the rescue team, and went back to his watch. When the rescue team cut through, Marcus had been awake for 22 hours. He was the only occupant conscious, coherent, and standing, one hand on the intercom, the other on my granddaughter's shoulder. He asked if everyone was okay. The leader said yes. Marcus said good. Then he sat down and fell asleep in 30 seconds, his body releasing sleep with the controlled precision of a hand opening when the object it held has been safely delivered. My granddaughter is alive because a 12-year-old human could not be forced into sleep when other creatures needed a waking mind. His biology assessed the room, deprioritized its own survival mechanism, and held that deprioritization stable for 6 hours without training or chemical support, in a species with no evolutionary reason to care whether 7 alien children lived or died. This was not willpower. Willpower degrades under load. Thessany warriors collapse at hour 30. This was architecture. His brain did not fight sleep. It deferred sleep, filed it as lower priority than the survival of the organisms around him, held that filing for 6 hours, released it with the precision of a reactor shutdown when the replacement crew arrived. This is what I need you to understand before you board your ships. The 9th story is about me, and I tell it last because it is the one that made me who I am. 23 cycles ago, I was a junior trade analyst assigned to a human agricultural station on the colony world they call New Rosario. Routine work. 5-day assignment evaluating grain production methods. On the 3rd night, seismic sensors detected a tremor, small but enough to crack the foundation of the southern agricultural dome. The dome held a full season of seed grain. 400 families depended on it. Contaminated groundwater was seeping through. Station Chief Hector Menezes organized a repair crew in 20 minutes, 11 humans, and me. I volunteered because the Vilu believe those who eat the bread should help bake it. Hector looked at me, chose kindness over honesty, handed me work gloves and said, "Stay close to me, Pelun." The repair required sealing the crack from inside while pumping contaminated water and building a drainage channel. Hard labor in a damp, confined space. Mineral dust, harsh portable lighting, cold, heavy air. 31 hours. The work was brutal in its simplicity and unending in its demand. Seal a meter of crack, wait for the sealant to set, test it with pressurized water, find the next section, repeat. The contaminated groundwater was cold and carried a mineral tang that coated the inside of my nostrils and settled into my fur in a way that no amount of washing would fully remove for days afterward. The portable lights cast hard shadows that made depth perception unreliable, So every movement had to be deliberate, checked, rechecked. The humans worked in pairs, one applying sealant while the other held the light and braced the applicator against the uneven surface. They talked to each other constantly, not conversation but coordination, a continuous low murmur of timing calls and material requests and pressure readings that functioned like the sonar of a single organism with 22 hands. I lasted 14 hours. At hour 14, the shutdown came, vision narrowing to a tunnel, limbs going heavy, thoughts looping in the perseverative cycle of a Velu brain demanding sleep payment. I sat against the wall with a sealant applicator locked in my grip because my fingers had seized. Hector knelt, pried the applicator from my hands with careful gentleness, put a blanket over my shoulders, said, "You did real good, Pelun, better than good, rest now, we have it," and went back to the crack and picked up where I had left off. I slept 17 hours. When I woke, the repair was complete, water diverted, grain safe. The crack sealed with an improvised compound the engineer had mixed at hour 26 when the standard sealant ran out, using construction adhesive and mineral powder tested on a sample surface and applied to the remaining 3 meters of crack. The compound held. It was still holding when I visited New Rosario 11 years later. The 11 humans were in the anteroom drinking coffee, none asleep. Hector had been awake 34 hours. He had a bandaged cut on his hand he seemed to have forgotten. He was discussing the drainage channel's long-term maintenance with his engineer, planning ahead, generating forward-looking infrastructure strategy. At hour 34. I apologized for sleeping. He waved it away, said I had worked harder than anyone expected. I asked how he felt. "Tired," he said, "but a good tired. The kind when you have done something that mattered and the evidence is right there in the sealed crack in the dry floor." He would sleep soon, he said, but first he wanted to make sure the sealant had cured properly. At hour 34, willing to defer sleep 1 more hour, because his biology permitted the choice and his character selected it. Because the job was almost done, and almost is not the same as done. I sat with them and drank their terrible coffee, and I felt something I had never felt before. Not fear alone, though fear was there. Not admiration alone, something older. All that borders on the superstitious. The feeling of a law of nature breaking. A law of biology you believed was universal, written into the architecture of consciousness itself. All minds must dim when the hours mount. All bodies must pay the tax. And then you sat with 11 tired, dirty, bandaged humans who walked through your universal law as though it were a suggestion. 11 minds that should have dimmed, that should have fragmented, that should have demanded the biological payment that consciousness requires of every creature in the compact. And they had not. They were tired. They were sore. They were bleeding from small cuts they had forgotten to bandage, but they were present. Fully, completely, stubbornly present, planning tomorrow's maintenance schedule, laughing at a joke someone had made at hour 29 that was apparently funnier now at hour 34, being alive in a way that my body at that moment could not replicate no matter how desperately I wanted to. The Velu word is socal. The trembling when a law you thought was universal is revealed to be local. You thought all creatures must sleep on this schedule, must pay this tax, must dim when the hours mount. Then you met the ones who do not dim. And you understood your law was only your law, and the universe is wider and stranger, and more terrifying than your body led you to believe. 72 hours, the number is not the point. The point is what fills those hours. Sustained, coherent, adaptive consciousness. A single human mind that outlasts a committee of Velu minds, not because the human is smarter but because the human is still there, still thinking, still watching, when the committee has gone to bed. The point beneath the point. Humans do not merely tolerate sleep deprivation, they exploit it. The locus coeruleus norepinephrine axis activates under sustained wakefulness and produces heightened alertness, narrowed focus, accelerated pattern recognition. The brain at hour 40 is not degraded, it is reconfigured. stripped of the social, the ornamental, focused into a beam, the hunting brain, the siege brain, built for 72-hour pursuit across open ground when the prey had to sleep and the human did not. The xenobiologists call it adaptive cognitive narrowing. I call it what it is, a predator's brain identifying the optimal state for sustained operation and selecting it voluntarily when the environment demands endurance. Every other species in the compact experiences sleep deprivation as a wound, a progressive failure of systems, a cascade of errors compounding toward shutdown. Humans experience it as a filter. The unnecessary falls away. What remains is sharper, harder, more dangerous than what was there at hour one. They do not become less as the hours mount. They become less of everything except the thing that matters. Their ancestors chased prey animals across the African savanna for days, not faster, longer. The prey sprinted and rested, and each rest was shorter because the animal's stress hormones prevented full recovery. The human walked, jogged, walked again, never stopping, never sleeping. And when the prey collapsed from exhaustion on the second or third day, the human was still there, still walking, still watching, still perfectly, terrifyingly functional. You are trade delegates. You will sit across tables from these people. You must understand that the human can simply wait. Remain at the table 2 days and 3 nights and emerge sharper, while you rotate through 12 minds and lose coherence with every handoff. This is not a warning against trading with humans. The conquered depends on them. They are honest dealers, but the advantage operates whether they intend it. Bryce did not plan to accumulate command. He stayed awake, and command migrated to the mind that never blinked. The Terk 3 team did not plan an 11% advantage. They maintained continuous attention while we fragmented ours. Prepare for it. Document every proposal in real time. Structure rotations for clean memory transfer. Designate a chief analyst who reads transcripts during sleep and enters each shift current. Above all, do not try to match the human schedule. You cannot. A Velu negotiator at hour 20 is a liability. Sleep when you must. Document everything. Trust your replacements. And never, under any circumstances, allow pride or professional ego to convince you that you can keep pace with a human across a second night. You cannot. Your biology will not permit it. The shame of admitting this is smaller than the cost of discovering it at hour 23 when your signature is on a contract you cannot remember reading. Remember the number. 72. I have spent 41 cycles collecting these accounts, and I will spend however many cycles remain to me collecting more, because the archive must grow, and the understanding must deepen, and the next generation of delegates must walk into human space with their eyes open and their protocols sound. The old texts call creatures that do not sleep demons. Our ancestors believed sleep was a covenant with the divine, and anything that refused the covenant walked between worlds. I am a modern Velu, a scientist, a diplomat, a grandmother who drinks terrible human coffee and owes her granddaughter's life to a boy who would not close his eyes. I do not believe in demons. But I believe in 72 hours, and when I sit across a table from a human who has been awake since yesterday and shows no sign of dimming, I feel something ancient stir at the base of my skull. Something older than language, older than reason, older than the conquered itself. The pre-knowledge. The deep certainty that the creature across from me was built by a world that demanded more from its children than my world demanded from me, and that the difference is not will but architecture, and architecture cannot be bargained with or matched or overcome. Only respected. So Kel, the trembling when a universal law breaks. Go now, trade well, sleep when you must. They are still awake.